Good evening, everybody. I'm Roger Williams, and welcome to History Author Talks. I am so pleased that you're joining us. I am here in New Jersey. It's nice and chilly this evening. And as always, we have another great show for you lined up. Before we start, I call your attention to these two logos over my shoulders. 10crucialdays.org is my nonprofit supporting historic education in central New Jersey. Always happy to get donations. We give tours and teach about the 10 crucial days of the American Revolution. Knox Press is my company. I publish military history with a focus on the American Revolution. So I am very pleased this evening that you are here to join us. And I will be introducing our guest in just one moment. First, I just want to share screen here and show you his book. Tonight, we are being joined by Trenton Cole Jones. Cole is a professor of history at Purdue University. And I met Cole at Society Military History Conference a few years ago. I have been admiring his papers and his work, and I was very pleased when Captives of Liberty came out. I went out, scooped it up, bought it, read it with a vengeance, he'll tell us about the cover in a minute, the word in the cover. And then COVID hit. So Cole managed, I think, to get out and about and do about 5 events in 2019 when the book came out. And I am pleased to sort of reawaken this wonderful book, because I think that it is not only fascinating, a slice of the American Revolution that you don't normally hear about, but it's a hell of a good read. It's really exciting, actually. So with that, I want to introduce you now to Cole Jones. So let me add Cole there. Excellent. Cole, it's great to see your smiling face now that you've recovered from COVID, having just returned from the Association of American Historians. So it's great to see you.
Great to see you, Roger.
Tell us a little bit about how you got into teaching American history and the American Revolution, and how you came to write Captives of Liberty.
Wonderful, Roger. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks to everyone who's tuning in at home. I really appreciate the support. As Roger was saying, my book came out right before COVID, and so my quote unquote book tour was cut short. It's a shame, but so yeah, it's a great question. And in some respects, I came by my study of history, the academic study of history, in a peculiar way. And it may not sound peculiar to this audience, but for most academics, people who go in to get a PhD, when they're in undergraduates, they might be majoring in history, they're studying it there for the first time, and then they are enthralled by some problem that they need to solve, and then they go off to graduate school and do a PhD and become a college professor. And in effect, I went about this the wrong way, in that my interest in history began early, and I mean very early. I want to say around year 5. I grew up in the Hudson River Valley of New York, where the Revolutionary War was never too far away. And I dragged my poor parents, I think, to every battlefield from Lexington and Concord to Cowpens, South Carolina, and everything in between. Every fort known to man. They were good sports. And so I came by this sort of, it's almost like a boyish enthusiasm for the subject, the drama of it. And was really enthralled and just couldn't be dissuaded. This is what I'm going to do. I'm a historian of the American Revolution. And I show up to graduate school at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm quickly shown to be the only one in the room who feels this way. Everyone there is angry about something. None of them are excited about, certainly not the American Revolution. And in fact, the revolution was very much at that time in the early 2000s, just not on the agenda of academic historians. It had basically been put to bed in many ways by a sort of fierce debate between Gordon Wood and Bernard Bailyn and people who advocated sort of ideological interpretation of the revolution, and more social historians who were looking at the role of ordinary people, of enslaved people, indigenous people, et cetera. These two sort of camps basically had agreed, we're never going to agree. And so nothing had really been done on the revolution, or not much had been done on it in a while. And in particular, the looks I got in seminar when I said, well, I want to study the Revolutionary War. Like, the war has nothing to do with the revolution. That's not interesting. The revolution happened in the hearts and minds of the American people before a drop of blood was ever shed at Lexington. Haven't you read your John Adams? And so consequently, it was, and this reflected, I think, a sort of bias in academia against military history in general. And so nobody wanted to hear about the Revolutionary War. And it's occurred to me that historians themselves had sort of siloed. Historians of the American Revolution were interested in the causes and the consequences of the revolution, right? What caused the break with Great Britain and what came out of it? They weren't interested in the course or the process of revolution. And it struck me that if these profound changes occurred, and we can all agree that going from a monarchy to a democratic republic is a profound transformation, then what effect might this have had on the process of the war? And what role did the war have on that the process of revolution? And those were the sort of driving questions that I brought to graduate school.
So Cole, tell me, I know we've had these conversations. You insist on calling this the conflict the Revolutionary War instead of the War for Independence. What tell our audience your point.
Absolutely, Roger. And this is a hill I'm willing to die on. Please, everyone here, banish War for Independence from your vocabulary, because I think that it's done so much harm in the historiography. Again, separating the war, which is just this kind of boring War for Independence, away from what's truly radical and transformative about the revolution, which of course is the political revolution or it's the social revolution. But the war really has nothing to do with that. And so I saw that in the historiography, much, and in some respects also in the popular imagination. So if you ask most people what the American Revolution is, they're going to tell you, well, the war against England, right? That's where we fought them at Lexington and Concord, and Washington crossed the Delaware and got to Trenton and bested the Hessians. Maybe something about Yorktown, right? With the Declaration of Independence thrown in there, but it's a war. But for most academics, no, the war is totally peripheral, or that was the case. And so my argument to you, Roger, is that in fact this conflict, the 8 years, right, double the length of the American Civil War, 8 years of war was an incredibly transformative experience for the people lived through it. It was a radical and a revolutionary conflict, fundamentally unlike prior colonial conflicts. And we have to appreciate that. Nobody would call, the French Revolutionary Wars War of Independence for monarchy, or the War of the French Independence, the War of the French Republic. No, this was a revolutionary war, and I think we need to be very mindful of that. Now, that's not necessarily what either the elite founders that we often put on pedestals, or even the British wanted or thought it might be. That's what happened, and trying to understand that process, I think, is important.
You are connected, but I don't know what
Vic,
you trying to do the.
Vic, I'm trying to mute you, Vic. Vic, I'm trying to mute you here. You are connected, so for some reason I can't mute you. Oh, all right. So, all right. So before we get into the war, I want you to explain the subtitle of your book, Captives of Liberty. The subtitle is Prisoners of War and the Politics of Vengeance in the American Revolution. What is the politics of vengeance?
Right. So to take a small step back, when I was in graduate school and rummaging around for a dissertation, I thought this idea of prisoners might be a useful lens onto the war and to try and understand the relationship between the political revolution and the war itself, because prisoners are a pain in the neck. Having lived through the war on terror, it was a very sort of formative period in my intellectual upbringing. I was in college, at 9/11. And so that experience was very serious. So these prisoners are a real issue. There's all kinds of material questions. What do you actually do with these people? But also political questions, right? Do we call them prisoners? Are they criminals? Do we put them on trial? Do we release them, et cetera? So these are real practical issues. And nobody had sought to sort of figure those out. And I thought that this might be an interesting lens or window that connecting these two issues, the political revolution and the war. And what I found, and I hope we can go into a bit more detail discussing it, is that these prisoners basically become pawns in what I call this politics of vengeance, where both sides are using prisoners for their political advantage and engaging in a tit for tat escalating, beginning proportionally, but then escalating exponentially violence against these prisoners. And the prisoners suffer on both sides. So it's one thing, it was well known in the historiography literature that the British, all those dastardly British and their prison ships in New York Harbor, but in fact, British and Hessian and Loyalist prisoners, indigenous Americans, and formerly enslaved Africans are caught up in this and become victims of this escalating politics of vengeance.
So you mentioned the prison ships. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but let's start at the very beginning. So how did the Enlightenment, I mean, we're in the Age of Enlightenment. How did the Age of Enlightenment thinking influence the conduct of war before the American Revolution? This will lead to my next question. So I'm curious to hear.
It's good.
What was the thinking of prisoners going into the American Revolution?
So with any historical project, it's very necessary to build up the context in which people are living before these things happen, right? Before your story really takes off. So my first question when I approached this topic of prisoners of war was, okay, what do people think about prisoners of war, right? What did they have rules for how they should be treated? Did they have any, what are the ideas? What were the sort of what I call cultural norms, sort of expectation? Today, of course, coming out of the Second World War in particular, but even before the Second World War, we have all of these international laws, right? Several Geneva Conventions, et cetera, about how prisoners are meant to be treated. But in the 18th century, there is no United Nations. There's no international court. There's no way to adjudicate these issues. What there was is a very strongly held cultural norm, sort of ideas about how to conduct war. And these were incredibly influenced by Enlightenment thinkers. And so, and I like to, and I do this in my book, I like to juxtapose the 17th century, and in particular, the wars of the mid-17th century, wars ending in 1648, the 30 Years' War, as a period of great religious strife in which Europeans were tearing each other apart over salvation, over who was, who was getting into heaven, the Protestants and the Catholics, as well as, of course, realpolitik as well. And in those conflicts, prisoners were horribly abused. It was incredibly violent conflict, probably not rivaled again in Europe until the Napoleonic Wars, maybe even the total wars of the 20th century. And so in the aftermath of that, people are basically worn out. They're tired of this extreme violence. It has really a sapping effect on Europeans. And that coincides with an era that historians call the Enlightenment, right? An era of growing secularization, moving away from this sort of religious politics, an era in which science, based on natural observation, the power of human reason becomes valued. And for the first time, Europeans start to look around and say, you know what? Pain is not actually a good thing. And this is sometimes hard for us to put ourselves into their shoes. But for centuries, right, the suffering of Christ, right, to suffer was what you did as a human being, as a Christian. You suffered on earth. That was the point. But by this period of sort of the early decades of the 18th century, people, late 17th, early 18th century, people say, well, maybe pain's not such a good thing. And if pain's not such a good thing, then maybe we should try and ameliorate it, make it better. Maybe we shouldn't hurt people as much. And this actually, all of these sort of issues coincide to really have a limiting effect on the violence of war. And I think historians sometimes can make too much out of this idea of the limited wars of the 18th century. There was certainly great violence perpetrated in these conflicts, but there's something really real there as well. The war could be controlled and it could be limited.
So before I go on, I forgot to remind the audience, my regulars will know that we welcome questions for Cole. Use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to send those questions. The questions will come to me, and I will ask Cole your questions. We'll get to as many of them.
Yeah, Roger, and I realized I didn't fully answer your last question. I get carried out. I sometimes go off on tangents. I'm those kind of college professors. But I did want to say a little bit about this idea of the law of nations, what they call, Europeans in the 18th century called the law of nations.
That was my next question.
Yeah, okay, good. The law of nations is not the same thing as modern international law, right? There's no court to adjudicate it. But what the law of nations was basically a shared understanding among Europeans, as well as their colonists, of how war should be conducted and what types of things are okay, what types of violence are sanctioned, socially acceptable, and what aren't, right? What you can do and what you cannot do. And these were designed to limit the violence of war, and so to prevent the sort of the sacking of cities that you saw during the 30 Years' War, to prevent the murder of prisoners, prevent the murder of civilian non-combatants, etc. And believe it or not, it actually really does have a limiting effect, because if you are the king, let's say you're the king of France and you've got a big army and you're fighting King of Prussia, and the two of you are going at it, at the end of the battle, the Prussians are going to have some of your prisoners and you're going to have some of the Prussian prisoners. And you could kill them, you could enslave them as the Romans did, or you could swap them, right? This idea of exchange. These prisoners actually have a value to the nation states, these sort of budding nation states, monarchical powers that have sent them to war. And so European states, when they would enter into armed conflict, would very often sign a treaty that was known as a cartel. It's an official treaty between belligerent powers. And it says, okay, here's how we're going to treat prisoners. Here's how we're going to exchange them. Here's exactly how much food they should have, what clothing they should have, who should pay for it, and how they can be exchanged, right? So a private soldier for a private soldier, a sergeant for a sergeant, a lieutenant for a lieutenant, et cetera, on the list. And you could say if you had 10 privates, but you didn't have a lieutenant, you could trade, right? So 10 privates makes a lieutenant. And believe it or not, it actually surprised me, given how sort of inchoate European bureaucracies were in the early and middle decades of the 18th century. This works pretty well. During the 7 Years' War, France and Britain signed a cartel that stipulates that prisoners will be exchanged within 2 weeks. And most of the time they do. Most of the time they're successful at doing that. And so all of this basically, it prevents a burden on either side. So you get your people back, they get their people back, and neither one of you has to hold these people and feed them, lock them up, or guard them, move them about, et cetera, for long periods of time. And so it worked really well in a European context.
So explain parole a little bit more. I mean, what, you know, how does it work when you are captured, if you are rank and file versus an officer?
Yes, that's a very good question. So parole, of course, coming from the French, which was the lingua franca of Europe, right? It was the diplomatic language. Parole just means word, but you gave your parole your word of honor, right? And this was premised on an idea of a shared sense of honor among the European aristocracy, right? That's sort of the upper echelons of European society. To be a gentleman, to be a man of honor, to be born into that social class entitled you to that honor, but you had to defend it. You could lose your honor if somebody cast aspersions on you or said you'd been up to some dirty dealings. You had to literally defend your honor on the field of honor. And this is how dueling culture develops. So there's both a limiting effect and an escalating effect on violence, honor. But these European officers, if you've captured let's say you're French again, and you captured a Prussian officer in the 7 Years' War. Okay, well, that Prussian officer, who almost certainly spoke French, would offer his parole, and then he would basically be allowed to do one of two things. Either live in your camp among you, right, treated as a gentleman and an officer, usually dining at your table, etc., all on credit, of course, or even be allowed to return to his own army in order to effect an exchange. So if you were a Prussian captain, well, you could go back to the Frederick the Great's army and you could say, do we have a French captain here? Yes, okay, send him back for me. And so that basically ensured that these officers would return to their regiments in relative good order and relatively quickly. Again, nobody's piling up a lot of debt is key. That does not work for enlisted men. Because if you are a European aristocrat, you believe that common people, ordinary people, when I say to my students, people who work with their hands, people who work with their hands.
Hey, Cole, can I talk for a minute?
Sure, yes.
Sure.
Okay, I'm wondering what we're going to do now. What are we going to do about these 700 people that have been put in jail? They're in solitary confinement. What are we going to do now? I totally understand that they are incarcerated in situations that are not constitutional.
Gary, I'm sorry. This is not what this show's about. So I'm sorry. We're going to have to move along here.
Yeah, I mean, the modern, just to briefly say that the modern sort of issues of prisoner treatment, these issues are still with us, right? And what do you do with people who you do not legitimately conceive to be a legitimate combatant? Right? Are these people, are they terrorists? Are they criminals? Are they freedom fighters? Or are they legitimate combatants representing, a state? Well, maybe they don't, maybe they do. And this becomes very murky legal ground. And as I say, I'm a historian, so I make no claims to the power of prognostication, which is my way of saying that I cannot predict the future. But these issues that were prescient and pressing during the revolution are still with us today.
So this next question, I understand, is very difficult to answer, but I'm asking you to just give us the big picture. Tories and Loyalist prisoners, how were they treated versus how were the British treated by the Americans versus how were the Hessians treated versus how were the Americans treated? I mean, it's just, sorry, let me just shut this up. Sorry. So, so by groups, tell us about the Tory and Loyalist prisoners, about the British prisoners, about the Hessian prisoners and the American prisoners, and Indians and women. I mean, what are the demographics of prisoners here?
Yes, it's a great question, and it's one of the key contentions of my book that it changes over time, right? That historians, we're looking to see, okay, what effects did war have, the experience of war have on the practice of war, et cetera. And so it depends on where you are and when you are. But at the very beginning of the conflict, the British, let's put ourselves in their shoes. It's another one of the great things that historians have. We have this toolkit we call empathy, right? That you have to be able to put yourselves in the shoes of people who are radically different than you are, who lived 200 years ago. Okay, so you're these British ministers, right? It is your job to quell what is an unlawful rebellion, right? The Americans have, colonists, many of them have taken up arms against the British law. They've killed British subjects, British soldiers, etc. You know, are they freedom fighters? Can you look at them and say, well, these are just good patriots standing up for what they believe? Or are they legitimate combatants? Are these like a fellow army? Do you recognize them as a legitimate army? Or are they traitors, right? Or have they committed treason? And if so, what are the punishments? And so the British had this problem in that, and I think we do ourselves a disservice, Roger, very often when we say, oh, these plucky patriots defeated the greatest empire the world had seen since Rome and the largest and most powerful army in the world. Actually, the British Army is puny. It's tiny by European standards, tiny by comparison to the French or even the Prussian armies, the Spanish army, for a variety of political reasons. And they just don't have enough troops to go around and arrest every John Adams and every John Hancock. And when they try to do so at Lexington and Concord, they get themselves in trouble, right? So you're the British minister. You have to say, okay, what am I going to do? It's a sort of carrot and stick, right? So yes, we got to punish these traitors, but we also have to like convince everyone else to come in on our side and be loyal to the crown. So you can't just hang people, right? They talk about it, they threaten it sometimes. Thomas Gage famously threatens Washington that he wants to hang him, but they don't actually do it. So instead, the American prisoners for the entirety of the war, really until 1782. When Parliament changes its mind. For the entirety of the war, American prisoners are going to live in this sort of limbo, right? It's almost like Guantanamo Bay, 1776, which is it's a bit snarky, but they're not actual combatants. They cannot trade them, exchange them, offer them parole the same way you would the French, right? Who are legitimate. They're illegitimate. This rebellion is illegitimate, but you also can't kill them because you want to welcome them back into the confines of the British Empire, right? At the end of this war, you want to hug and make up and have them go back to making you a lot of money. So they're in a real rock and a hard place. And this is one of the main reasons that American prisoners start to pile up. And they start to pile up where the British are. And that's in particular in occupied coastal port cities, places like New York City, Newport, Rhode Island, later on Charleston, South Carolina, Philadelphia very briefly. And these prisoners pile up, but what are you going to do with them? And so when prisoners start to pile up in the 18th century, in an age before modern medicine, what are you going to get? You're going to get a lot of dead prisoners, right? Because disease is going to spread throughout these camps. So that's the first side. That's the sort of British side of this issue. The American side, from the beginning, they want to say, look at us. We are the victims here. We are being victimized by a tyrannical and usurpacious parliament that are taking away our British liberties. We're standing up for those liberties. We're the true English people. We're going to play by the rules. And so the revolutionaries, Congress at the beginning, and then George Washington in particular, double down on these European, what they call the laws of nations. We're going to treat the British really, really well. And so British and Hessian prisoners from the beginning are given incredible leniency by Washington and the Continental Congress. But as my book shows, as the war goes on, that's going to radically, radically change. But to give just two more sentences briefly about groups, if there's one group of people who suffer the most in the Revolutionary War, I've become 100% completely convinced, it is active loyalists. Those people who are willing to stand up for the British Crown and Parliament against their patriot-leaning neighbors. The numbers are maybe 1/5 of the population were at some point in the war expressed active loyalist sentiment. It's probably even, if over the course of the war, looking really committed loyalists, I would say it's significantly less. Maybe 50,000 Americans took up arms for the British. And when those people are captured, that becomes a problem. Because if you were from New Jersey and you were captured by New Jersey troops, you are not treated as a British prisoner of war who can be negotiated with or exchanged. After the 4th of July, 1776, you have just committed treason. Not against the United States, right? But against the state of New Jersey, the sovereign Commonwealth of New Jersey. And you are a traitor by going over to the British and by taking up arms. And the punishment for treason in New Jersey, as it was for every single one of the 13 United States, was death by hanging. Okay, are they revolutionaries hanging loyalists left and right? A lot more than we used to think, but they also realize they're in this sort of carrot and stick position. They don't want to alienate what they call the disaffected, sort of ordinary people who were just trying to get by and didn't want to be bothered one way or the other. They don't want those people going over into the British camp. And so there's a real politics. So this is all playing into what I call the politics of vengeance. There's a lot of anger on the side of ardent patriots against loyalists in particular, but also British, Germans, Native Americans, and formerly enslaved Africans, etc. A lot of anger, popular anger, and demands for vengeance. And those demands will be met by their local state governments, first and foremost upon loyalists, but also increasingly upon British, and particularly British, but also German and other prisoners of war. So what you get is a sort of twofold civil war. And I think this is another thing we need to think about the revolution, is it's a civil war on two fronts. It's a civil war in the British Empire, because on the 19th of April, 1775, everybody, all 2.5 million, or the 2 million free, I should say, 2 million free colonial British Americans see themselves as British. And so this is a British Civil War, right? It is this, in many ways, the second British Civil War after the one of the mid-17th century. So that's the first level. But then it also becomes an American Civil War. It's going to divide families, divide communities, and pit those people who are willing to risk it all for the crown against those who have come to accept the new government, the new status quo. And so it becomes this vicious internecine conflict. And everywhere the British can project a little bit of power, you see this cycle of spiraling violence.
So explain the role of government. I mean, did either Congress or Parliament have any effect to the treatment of prisoners? I mean, what were their orders in essence? And the research, how closely did the military authorities adhere to what their governments were telling them?
Yeah, it's great. So that again is one of the key insights that my book offers. I'll start with the British because in effect they're actually the easiest. The British colonial ministry, headed by Lord George Germain, who's the guy in charge of managing this war effectively on behalf of the king and Parliament, basically says we do not negotiate with terrorists. So you cannot officially negotiate with these American rebels because they are rebels in arms and they're traitors, and so you're not gonna negotiate with them. We're not gonna sign a cartel. We're not gonna officially exchange prisoners. Okay, well then you're General William Howe, soon to be Sir William Howe, and you've beaten the rebel army at the Battle of Long Island. Now you've got thousands of prisoners, right? Then you capture Fort Washington in November of 1776. Thousands more prisoners. You're occupying New York City, but New York City's burned. Most of the city is in ruins. What are you going to do with these people? You can't really negotiate with Washington, can't really let them go. And in effect, these guys stay in limbo for a while until they're dying at such a great rate that Howe basically just lets them go. He sends them back to Washington in the winter of 76, 77. So from the British perspective, they can't officially negotiate for swaps, but they're very willing to unofficially do it. They're willing to say, I've got this general, you've got this general, let's sort of meet in the middle and swap them. Or, I've got this number of troops, what are you going to do? And here's where it becomes a problem. It becomes a problem because the Continental Congress, right, the thing passing for a national government is not actually a national government. It's basically like the UN. It's an assembly of diplomats from 13 separate and sovereign states. And so they actually have very little power. Right? The Continental Congress cannot tax. The Continental Congress is technically supervising the Continental Army, But in effect, they're basically leaving most of that up to General Washington, certainly after the campaigns around New York. What are you going to do? And then Washington, for his part, is utterly dependent upon the individual states. Remember, almost all of the continental regiments belong to individual states. So his armies are coming from Jersey and Connecticut, whatever else. He's dependent upon them. He's dependent upon requisitions of supplies and money from these individual states. So he's not calling the shots. Washington can't go to the governor of New Jersey and say, Mr. Livingston, give me all your prisoners. I know he can't do it because he tries. And William Livingston says, no, I'm not going to give up these prisoners because they're useful to me. I've either set them to work and there's a huge labor shortage in all of these states as men run off to the army or the privateers. I've either set them at work or I want to hold them to get New Jersey men back. Because if I hand my New Jersey boys to you, George, you're going to try and get Virginians. Maybe. And in fact, Washington says, I'm neutral in this. I want to exchange guys based on length of captivity. So how long have you been a captive? The longest in captivity, those should be the first that we swap with the British when they're willing to. But individual states say, no, because I am not going to trade British regulars that my New Jersey troops captured for Virginia men. I'm going to hold out. And by holding out that way, they're forced then to deal with them. They're forced then to put them in camps where the conditions deteriorate very rapidly, where these prisoners begin to die. And it becomes a huge quagmire. And in effect, Congress is always trying to assert control over the prisoners and trying to control this war effort. But as I argue in my book, the Continental Congress never establishes a monopoly on violence. Every other what you could call national government in Europe has a monopoly on violence, right? That means that the king of France, he's the one that controls violence, right? Everyone works for him. L'état, c'est moi, as they said. The state is me. I command the army. I command the militia. I command, I have a monopoly on violence because of this sort of inchoate federal system where each individual state is independent and sovereign. The Continental Congress has no control over them. They can recommend things. They can ask nicely. But if the individual governor of the state decides, I think not, then they're out of luck. And that leads to this sort of spiraling, deteriorating conditions for British prisoners in American captivity. And this is going to continue really for the rest of the war, as the British are anxious by let's say after the defeat of Burgoyne's army at Saratoga in October of 1777. Suddenly, the Americans now have 6,000 British regular troops. Okay, that's a lot of men that the British want back. And actually, again, we need to remember the British army is really small, so 6,000 men is a lot of guys. And they are trying to negotiate for the return, or at least the Americans would hold up their end of the bargain, and the Americans won't do it. Roger, I think you're on mute.
All right, sorry about that. So let's go to a little bit of a different theater, if you will.
Sure.
We know that there were many Native American tribes, the Indians, who were involved on both sides. Did they have prisoner exchanges? Tell us about what was going on. This question actually comes from Bob Wong, who comes to many of our shows. He actually shows up at a lot of conferences, and he's very well read. I think it's a great question. Tell us about how the Indians incorporated POWs into their tribes, or did they agree to prisoner exchanges?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's another thing I think we sometimes forget when we paint the story as a story of Britain against the United States. In fact, there are many different powers at play, and Indigenous Americans have an enormous role in the Revolutionary War, both in precipitating it, starting it, and also in the waging of it or the fighting of it. Because both sides realize that once you get about 100 miles away from the coast, 100, 150, depending on where you are, indigenous people start to have more and more power, right? Especially on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, right? That line that the British Parliament in 1763 drew, and that on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, that is indigenous America, right? They are the power brokers there. Different nations are playing a real role. So from the beginning, and again, I think let's remember how actually weak the British state was in the Americas. They realized right away that they need help. And so anyone who can help them, they're going to be at least listening to. And they're anxious to encourage at least Native Americans at first to stay out of the war. Like, don't help the Americans. But then once the war progresses and they realize that they're growing desperate, then they begin encouraging Native Americans to attack colonial or American settlements. And in the process, Native Americans, as I'm sure you all realize, have a very different culture of war, right? They have a very different ideas, norms about how war should be fought. They're not standing in a line, blazing away at muskets at 100 yards with flags and drums, right? They have a very different idea about how war should be conducted that has developed over thousands of years and has altered, obviously, with conflict with Americans and Europeans, but nonetheless is very unique to Native peoples. And one of those, of course, is that captives. When you make a captive, that person is then a symbolic. It represents it's a symbolic victory as well as a material one. So a enemy prisoner, if you've gone and attacked a town and you've captured a man, right, a fellow brave or warrior, right, that person now belongs to you, and you can do one of two things. You can either ritualistically torture that person to death, which would, in many respects, return the balance to the universe as they saw it for an indigenous American or one of your own nation who'd been killed, right? You need one to balance the other. Or you can adopt that person into your nation and then treat them eventually as a family member, as a member of your nation to increase your population. So that's a very different way of thinking about prisoners than the British or the Americans. And so from the beginning, the British are wary about this. How are they going to negotiate captives that are taken? For the American part, they had enough experience fighting indigenous Americans in the 7 Years' War, in prior colonial conflicts, King George's War, et cetera, that by this period, by the third quarter of the 18th century, they had developed the idea that Native peoples are savages, right? They do not play by the rules. They don't understand the law of nations. And because King George has incited, as Jefferson calls them, the merciless Indian savages to attack our frontiers, they are therefore beyond the pale of civilization and not subject to the laws of war, meaning that there is not going to be a thing as an Indian prisoner of war. Try to find one. When Native Americans are captured by American forces, they are killed. They're either not captured or they are killed. Because these people are not equals in the eyes of Anglo-Americans, and they're not entitled to the protections of prisoner of war status, which is going to lead to some of the most vicious fighting on the New York frontier. Here I'm thinking of the Battle of Oriskany, the Battle of Newtown, et cetera. In the West, during George Rogers Clark's campaign, George Rogers Clark famously tomahawks an Indian prisoner in the head in front of the British commander at Fort Sackville, Henry Hamilton, as a sort of warning, like, you don't surrender now, I'm going to kill all of you guys too. And in fact, I found plenty of evidence of, in particular, Canadians, so French-Canadian habitants who were loyal to Britain and fought alongside, particularly the Mohawk war parties during Burgoyne's campaign. When these French Canadians, white Europeans though they were, of European descent, are captured wearing indigenous dress, so wearing a loincloth, wearing painted and war paint or whatnot, Continental soldiers will treat them as indigenous people and execute them. Whereas if they'd been wearing a regimental coat, they would have been treated as a prisoner of war. So incredibly vicious on both sides, but the indigenous people are definitely getting raw end of this deal. As George Washington makes very clear, when George Washington sends General Sullivan into Iroquois with the orders to extirpate the Iroquois. And so it really there's a sort of racial element that develops a sort of race war quality to that. And there's no place for prisoners of war in a race war.
So earlier, we talked about American prisoners, British prisoners, Hessian prisoners. What with the Loyalists, one of our audience members asks about the Civil War nature of families turning in other family members, or tell us about I know it's going to get brutal here, but tell us about the Loyalists who were captured by Americans.
Yeah, so it worsens over the course of the conflict. At the beginning, Washington and the Continental Congress give explicit instructions that the Loyalists, these deluded wretches, as they often call them, should not be harmed in their person or property, because the idea is you want to win them over to your side. But after independence and as the war progresses, there's no longer a possibility space for these two people to live together. It's either you're with us or you're against us. And so every colony will pass, now state, after 4th July 1776, every state will pass laws basically forcing you to attest. These are called test acts, to attest that you're a loyal subject of that state. And if you don't sign that, then you're in trouble, because you're refusing to abide by the law. Effectively, you're an outlaw. The other thing I think we need to realize is just how quickly the revolutionaries seize power in every single colony and take over the apparatus of local government and law enforcement from the very beginning. And so they're very good at rooting out who the suspected Loyalists, what they call people who are inimical to the rights and liberties of America. And once you're captured, you're usually brought before a committee of safety, which is a sort of quasi-government, quasi-military organization. And then they, basically say, "Are you a Loyalist?" And if you refuse to recant, that's going to wind you up in jail. Now, if you were an old guy, you didn't seem like you were that much of a threat, and in particular, if the British are nowhere near, right? If it's safe, if you're out in central Pennsylvania and the British are nowhere near, then that person might be allowed to pass bail, especially if somebody in the community who was a patriot stood up for them and said, "Yeah, his politics are bad, but he's harmless." You could pay bail and then be released. If the British are there, right? So the British Army, let's say during the Philadelphia campaign, occupying Philadelphia, they're going out on raiding parties. They're inviting Loyalists to join their army because they need all the help they can get. Woody Holton in his latest book says we got to think of the British as the underdogs. He's 100% right. 100% right. They need all the help they can get, and so you join. I don't know, the Queen's Rangers or something. Well, you're in uniform, but you're now captured by the Americans. You're in uniform, but you're from Pennsylvania. What are you? Washington originally wants to try and exchange these guys as prisoners, but the individual states say no. And then you can be put on trial for treason, and you can be executed. What's even more common is vigilante justice. And this is particularly common in the South during the Southern campaigns of 1780 to 82, where groups of militia will hunt down Loyalists. They call it Tory hunting, the rage of Tory hunting, and go out and grab Loyalists and dispense vigilante justice or execute them on the spot. Virginia Colonel Lynch is famous for exercising what he called Lynch's Law, which was the immediate execution by hanging of any Loyalist he came upon. That the act of hanging somebody is oftentimes called lynching, where the term originated. So it really does become this brutal brother against brother civil war. And if I can offer just one sad story, is a story you probably all know, which is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's illegitimate son, William, was the royal governor of New Jersey. And when independence is declared, he can't. Okay? He's a threat to the new government. And so they send him to Connecticut in jail. And originally they treat him pretty well, or they tried to treat him pretty well, but he's got a loud mouth, says William Franklin, and he annoys all the people in Connecticut so much that they lock him into solitary confinement, where he grows very ill and nearly dies. And his father, Benjamin Franklin, won't do anything to help him. Won't spare a word to help him. And so when he finally does get out of prison, William Franklin will form a band of sort of almost extra legal militia, vigilante militia in New York called the Board of Associated Loyalists, whose whole job is to go out and basically wreak havoc on the civilian populations of Long Island Sound. So kidnappings, murders, they are engaging in the sort of retaliatory or war of vengeance. And so I think that's a great example of how this war really tore families apart and led to the escalating violence that my book attests to.
So
let's go back to the Sons of Liberty, 1765.
So let's talk about a couple of specific things. We can't talk about captives of liberty in the American Revolution without talking about prison ships. But let's talk about the prison ships and Simsbury mines.
Oh, I love it. I love it. So when I came upon this project, I was shocked to learn there really wasn't a single volume history of how the revolutionaries dealt with British Loyalist Hessian prisoners. There was a dissertation on Hessian prisoners that became a very good book by Daniel Krebs. And then there was another sort of community study by Ken Miller that was pretty good. But there's no sort of national story. What we did have was a lot of books about the HMS Jersey. And I suspect many of you will have heard of the dreadful prison ship, the HMS Jersey, that killed 11,000 Americans, apparently. And what is the Jersey? The Jersey, for most of the war, was a transport ship. So it was a large three-decker ship of war that was obsolete for fighting, that had transported troops over. The British, again, we need to remember, put ourselves in their shoes. Where are they? The British has a very small army, but they've got a powerful navy. So they can project power wherever there's water. So where are they? They're in New York City for most of the war. After the campaign of 1776, they are ensconced in New York City. New York City is burned out, right? Buildings destroyed. Where are you going to house all of these prisoners? Well, you're going to put them on ships, because guess what? Back in England, convicts were put on prison ships. And during the 7 Years' War, even French sailors have been briefly confined on what they call prison hulks in the Thames. So there was precedent for this, of putting people on prison ships. But the problem was you were meant to put somebody in a prison ship for like 2 weeks, maybe a month, until you can get them exchanged. Not years, not years. And so these guys are cramped below decks, overcrowded, and dying at alarming rates. The Jersey prison ship is actually only commissioned as a prison ship in 1780. So towards the end of the war. But nonetheless, the conditions are abominable, and I'm certainly not excusing it. But under the customs of war, the law of nations we've talked about, whose responsibility was it to pay for the American prisoners on the Jersey? The Americans, right? So the Americans are responsible for their own troops in enemy captivity, and vice versa. And at the beginning of the war, the British are paying for their soldiers, and the Americans are not, because Congress doesn't have enough money. So they're not paying for them, therefore they default on this. Well, the British say, okay, well, we can't, the Americans aren't paying, so what are we going to do? Well, we'll put them on half rations. And the logic was, well, they're not being physically active, so why do they need as many calories as a soldier? Remember, where are the British supply lines? Where are they getting stuff? 3,000 miles away, or what they can basically forage in and around the sort of suburbs of modern day New York City, right? That's it. So food is scarce in occupied New York as well. And so once you're undernourished, you're cramped below deck, as we've seen with COVID-19, disease spreads rapidly. Viruses can spread very rapidly. Many of these men are not, they don't have the smallpox vaccine yet. And so they die at alarming rates. What the Americans do, however, is the Americans employ prison ships of their own, but they don't need them, right? The Americans employ 5 of the 13 states have prison ships, and they do them for the purpose of revenge. And many of these ships are actually called Revenge or Retribution or some version of that, where they put British prisoners on these ships for the purpose of starving them effectively to death. The state of Connecticut is notorious because not only does Connecticut have a prison ship, which they don't need, they also turned an old lead mine in Simsbury, Connecticut, 70 feet below ground into sort of what one person said, the black hole of Calcutta, right? That the prisoners are actually lowered down into the mine. There's no light down there. The air is really stagnant. Disease spreads and they die. It's effectively a death sentence being sent to the Simsbury mine. All of this is for retaliation or revenge. All of this is examples of that politics of vengeance that I spoke about.
So one of, I mentioned to you before all of our audience came on that I have a lot of my Sons of the American Revolution compatriots who join us on these shows. Jonathan Dickey, who is with the Society, tells us about his ancestor who was actually with Arnold at the Quebec campaign and was captured and was for 6 months or more. He kept a journal, was kept as a prisoner. I think this goes back to what we were saying before. Some of the officers may have been exchanged very quickly, but the rank and file were not exchanged so readily. And perhaps you've just answered his question, Jonathan's question, as to why did it take so long for his patriot ancestor to be released? Perhaps because the Americans weren't paying.
Yeah, so I would highly recommend, Jonathan, that you check out chapter 2 of my book, which is all about the Canadian campaign and the prisoners that are captured in Canada. And that the British governor of Canada, Guy Carleton, is in a real sort of rock and a hard place here with the Americans that he's captured, because he knows he can't negotiate with Arnold over them, because Arnold, first of all, Arnold's not a gentleman, so we don't negotiate with gentlemen. We only negotiate with gentlemen. But also he's a rebel, and Benedict Arnold had a very coarse way about him. And so that's, what are we going to do? And this is also the beginning of the war, where there was no sort of, there was no prisoner of war policy on the British part. So, for instance, he ends up sending Ethan Allen to England to stand trial. He's like, this is a traitor. Like, he's a leader of these men. Send him off to England for that. But what is Carleton going to do? At first, he's rather severe towards them. And then they start to die and get sick in the winter. And then Carleton is actually a great humanitarian. He emerged as one of my favorite characters. I knew very little about him before writing this book, and come to really admire the man. He actually issues a fresh linen shirt to every one of the American prisoners who were suffering. But he's also got to try to figure out what to do. And eventually he's able to, because he don't want to hold these guys. They're a threat, right? They're inside his citadel at Quebec. So not a good situation. So eventually he's able to get them on ships. He's relieved, he gets reinforcements. This is when Burgoyne's army arrives, and he's able to send the Americans to Howe in New York. And then they become Howe's problem. Like, Carl's like, how you handle it. So that's the reason, is that it takes him a really long time to do that.
Well, for our next show, we should talk about the Convention Army, but we've reached the end of our hour. And honestly, I thank all of the audience I know we didn't get to everybody's questions. I do want to thank my friend and compatriot, Brooks Lyles, who is the chair of the Education Committee for the Sons of the American Revolution, who was able to answer a lot of questions from our audience members. So I hope that was helpful. So we sort of had information coming at you on both ends. We've jumped around a lot here tonight with Cole. We've asked him a lot of questions, and we've gotten a lot of great information. Nowhere near scratches the surface from what is in Cole's marvelous book. I can't shut my clock up, I'm sorry, but that just tells us we're at the top of the hour. But I do absolutely heartily encourage everyone to go to wherever books are sold and get a copy of Cole's book. It is, as I said at the beginning of the show, it is a terrific read. And you will learn a lot, but you will just also hear a lot of really great stories, as Cole has been telling you here this evening. So Cole, thank you for spending an hour with us. I thank the audience. I also want to encourage everybody to come back next week. We've got David Stewart and his novel, the first novel of his trilogy, the Overstreet trilogy. This is a novel of a Hessian family who emigrates to what was then Massachusetts, is today's Maine, in 1753. And it's sort of, we follow the Overstreet family through the French and Indian War and up to the Battle of Bunker Hill. Then we have Don Haggist, managing editor of Journal of the American Revolution, with his new book, The Distinguished Corps, the British Light Grenadier and Light Infantry Battalions of the American Revolution. Gene O'Connor on February 8th, The Remarkable Cause, a novel of James Lovell in the Crucible of Revolution. And Larry Kidder and his new book, Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man. This is marvelous research. Then in March, probably throw some other shows in between this, but Nancy Rubin Stewart and her new book, Poor Richard's Women, Deborah Reed Franklin and Other Women Behind the Founding Father. So on historyauthortalks.com, thanks to Tom McAndrew, my colleague from the American Revolutionary War Roundtables. We have the collection of other book talks that you can visit. That's and then some upcoming conferences. So we've got a lot to share there. Oh, did you not see all of that? I'm sorry. I thought I was sharing my screen. Sorry about that. But go to historyauthortalks.com. You'll see all the upcoming shows and some other shows. And as always, if you purchase any books from History Author Talks, the portion of the proceeds go to the Sons of the American Revolutionary War, Sons of the American Revolution Library. So thank you all for visiting us this evening. Again, thanks to Cole, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Roger. Thanks, everybody.